from country estate to revolutionary headquarters. Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters. NHS is home to many stories. These encompass not only the house and its inhabitants, but also the surrounding landscape and formal garden. This story, the story of the garden, provides rich insights into the history of the site and the people who cherished it. The formal garden you see today is a restoration of a colonial revival garden commissioned by Alice Longfellow, daughter of poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The beds are planted with early 20th century heirloom plants and have benches that provide places of quiet retreat. The garden is open for the enjoyment of all, every day, from dawn to dusk. In 1759, John Vassall began Vallel construction of a country estate on the outskirts of Cambridge. Along with the house and extensive farmland, Vassall built formal gardens around his new home. His original plans have been lost, but a 1775 map shows a sketch of a garden complex. On the eve of the American Revolution, Vassall and his family fled to Boston, abandoning the estate. In July 1775, General George Washington arrived to take command of the Continental Army. He used the abandoned house as his official headquarters for 9 months. By the end of the war, Vassall's gardens had largely vanished. A gentleman's garden. In 1791, the house was purchased by Andrew Craigie, former Apothecary General of the Continental Army and a wealthy businessman. Craigie greatly expanded the property, adding greenhouses and orchards and creating a landscape which blended seamlessly from garden to farm to wilderness. Craigie dug a picturesque pond with an island. 1759 Vassall House built 1791. Andrew Craigie purchases house 1837. Longfellow begins renting 1843. House is gifted to Longfellows. 1700, 1774 to 1776. Vassall leaves Washington's headquarters. 1800-1819 Death of Andrew Craigie. Death of Mrs. Craigie. 1882. Death of Longfellow to the west of the house, and planted hundreds of trees to replace those cut for firewood during the war. Sadly, no design plans survive from this period. After Craigie's death in 1819, his widow Elizabeth received the house and 95 acres of land as her dower portion. Over the years, Mrs. Craigie hosted many tenants, including Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, beginning in 1837. 1904 and 1924. Landscape Architects Redesign Garden. NPS receives 2005 Longfellow Garden House Restoration. 1900-1928. Death of Alice Longfellow, 1972 present. The Longfellow family, remembering the poet. The garden restored. During his years as a boarder, Congrello had already taken an interest in the grounds of the estate. After he and his new wife Frances received the property as a wedding gift, in landscape ISO Mike rooted a Sucan bridge. In winter, the Longfellow boys, Charlie and Ernie, skated on Craigie's old pond to the annoyance of their western neighbor. 1843, Henry soon invested himself fully dans all places, then, and in all seasons. In 1847, Longfellow in the landscape, flowers expand their light and soul-like wings, hired English landscaper, including he creation. Teaching us, by most persuasive reasons, Richard Dolben to of a lyre shaped, how akin they are to human things. Design a formal garden. Flowers, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, 1839. The result was an Italian Renaissance garden with appoints. In the fields behind the present garden, Longfellow created tree-lined grande allées and serpentine footpaths for wandering and pondering. The new Gothic rose window in the center and an overall Persian carpet pattern. Remnants of this design can still be the. Following Henry Longfellow's death in 1882, the garden fell into disrepair. Happily, the poet's daughter, Alice, took an interest in the garden, hiring one of America's first female landscape architects, Martha Brooks Hutcheson, to restore it in 1904. Hutcheson reestablished Longfellow's original boxwood parterres, then enclosed the garden with fences, gates, and a pergola to make an outdoor room typical of the colonial tale. At the center of the garden, Alice placed a sundial inscribed, "Pensa che questa di mai non ragiona," or "Think that this day will never dawn again." It was a favorite line of her father's from Dante's Purgatorio. Alice's architect cousin, Alexander Wadsworth Longfellow, created a small, personal garden just outside the main garden's southwest gate. There he constructed trellises against the side of the house around a solitary bench. Today, this garden is filled in early spring with daffodils and tulips, followed by ferns, roses, and autumn clematis through the fall. In 1924, Alice hired Ellen Biddle Shipman to rejuvenate the space. She was known for her painterly design, enclosed spaces, and for emphasizing the relationship between garden and house. Shipman planted the rectangular borders with heirloom roses and added evergreens and ornamental fruit trees to give the garden height. Just as importantly, Shipman made detailed planting diagrams and cultivar lists for future maintenance. In 1969, the Cambridge Plant and Garden Club renovated the garden, restoring the central rose window design but erasing the outer borders. Their garden was retained after the property came into the National Park Service in 1972. Aware that the garden was incomplete, the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, began a major fundraising effort to restore it to its former glory. Eventually, the capital campaign raised more than $1 million through private donations and grants. By 2003, enough money had been raised to start a multi-year garden restoration. Using Shipman's extensive documentation and heirloom varieties of plants, Alice's Colonial Revival Garden has been recreated for visitors to enjoy today. The pergola and fences are reproductions of the 1904 originals. The flowers are varieties and colors enjoyed by Alice Longfellow, and the central rose window feature honors Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's own design. Today, National Park Service gardeners care for this restored garden, which provides a place of beauty and respite for all who visit. The Vassall Craigie Longfellow House, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow once wrote, "All houses wherein men have lived and died are haunted houses." If we could summon the ghosts of the Vassall Craigie Longfellow House, we would find people who have given shape and substance to our world. For 200 years, this was a family home and a celebrated gathering place for singers and soldiers, poets and politicians. Its story encompasses slavery and emancipation, efforts to create a national identity through literature, and a family's endeavors to preserve and share the treasures of many nations. When Henry and Fanny Longfellow became the owners of 105 Brattle Street in Cambridge in 1844, they were already well acquainted with its history. The Georgian mansion looking over the Charles River was built in 1759 for John Vassall, a sugar plantation owner and future Loyalist. The Vassalls enslaved Cuba, Dinah, Malcolm, William, and 3 children. The house stood among other magnificent estates owned by fellow elites, many of whom were slaveholders. In 1774, the Vassalls and their neighbors fled the insurgency preceding the American Revolutionary War. The people they had enslaved seized the opportunity for freedom. In July 1775, Gen. George Washington arrived in Cambridge to command the fledgling Continental Army, which was laying siege to British-occupied Boston. He chose the large, strategically located Vassall House as his headquarters. Here, Washington received dignitaries and fellow revolutionaries, strategized with American generals, and celebrated the British Army's evacuation of Boston in March 1776. Andrew Craigie, the Continental Army's first apothecary general, bought the house in 1791, aiming to increase its grandeur and size. He and Elizabeth Shaw married in 1793. Lavish living and failed investments plunged them into debt, leaving Elizabeth to take in boarders after Andrew's death. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a young Harvard professor and up-and-coming poet, began renting 2 rooms in 1837. They were once George Washington's chambers, he marveled. The house again became a social center, this time for Henry's circle of colleagues and friends. In July 1843, Longfellow and Fanny Appleton married. Fanny's father, Nathan, a wealthy textile manufacturer, presented Castle Craigie to the couple as a wedding gift. The Longfellows thrived in the stimulating environment of Cambridge. Henry left his teaching position at Harvard, then devoted his time to writing and scholarship. Fanny was a gracious host and perceptive critic of art and literature who shared in Henry's many activities. The Longfellows and their children, Charles, Ernest, Alice, Edith, and Anne, their third child, Fanny, died at 18 months, cherished their piece of tangible history all their lives. They filled their days with learning and their home with evidence of travels, personal interests, and intellectual pursuits. In 1913, the children established the Longfellow House Trust to preserve their family home and open it to the public. The trust donated the site to the National Park Service in 1973. Explore this extraordinary house and meet the people whose indelible spirits remain. Once, within these walls, one whom memory oft recalls, the father of his country dwelt, and yonder meadows broad and damp, the fires of the besieging camp encircled with a burning belt. From To a Child by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, 1845. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow achieved much in his life, but he was first and foremost a writer. I most eagerly aspire after future eminence in literature, he told his father in 1824. My whole soul burns most ardently for it. He became one of America's most celebrated poets, offering the young nation heroes and stories of mythic shape and dimension. Longfellow was born in 1807 in Portland, Maine, the second son of a prominent lawyer and grandson of Jem and Peleg Wadsworth, a hero of the American Revolution. After graduating from Bowdoin College, he traveled in Europe, immersing himself in its languages, literature, and history. To my youthful imagination, he said, the Old World was a kind of holy land. Proficient in 8 languages, he spent his early career teaching language and literature at Bowdoin and Harvard colleges. His first collection of poetry was published in 1839. The popular Voices of the Night included A Psalm of Life, reprinted in newspapers across America. His marriage to Fanny Appleton and their social life allowed Longfellow's creativity to flourish. He retired from teaching in 1854 to devote himself fully to writing, and was soon enormously successful. Longfellow was the nation's first professional poet and gained an international reputation. His poetry collections were translated into dozens of languages and became instant bestsellers at home and abroad, enjoyed by laborers and scholars alike. Longfellow received honorary degrees from Cambridge and Oxford, posthumously honored in Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey. Composers Franz Liszt and Felix Mendelssohn set his works to music. A teacher and scholar, Longfellow was familiar with heroic themes in classical literature. His own stories and larger-than-life characters in The Song of Hiawatha have been absorbed into American culture. In Paul Revere's Ride, Longfellow turned a virtually unknown Boston silversmith into an icon on par with national founders like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. After Fanny's 1861 death in an accidental fire, he translated Italian poet Dante Alighieri's monumental Divine Comedy. Longfellow found consolation in this epic tale of salvation and enduring love. He founded the Dante Club, which met Wednesdays in his study for supper and conversation. I should have to think long if I were asked to name the man who has done more for America, said poet Walt Whitman after learning of Longfellow's death in 1882, a fitting tribute to a person who moved the world with words and spoke the language of his country's heart and history. The world within T. Henry and Fanny Longfellow's cosmopolitan and hospitable styles made their home a vibrant place. They enjoyed formal meals with friends and family, good conversation, and the occasional musical performance in the library. Henry's growing fame brought a widening range of visitors to his door, from perfect strangers to the famous and infamous. Notable guests included writers Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Anthony Trollope, and Julia Ward Howe. At breakfast one morning, Charles Dickens was here on his first trip to the United States. Controversial scientist Luis Agassiz came often to visit, and Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil met both Longfellow and Emerson here while traveling in New England. Singers, actors, and musicians made a pilgrimage to Cambridge, among them the Swedish nightingale, Jenny Lind, and stage actress Fanny Kemble. One of Henry's last visitors was playwright Oscar Wilde, who said, Longfellow was himself a beautiful poem. Born in the wake of the American Revolution, Longfellow witnessed momentous events of the 1800s: westward expansion, the social and political turmoil around slavery, and the U.S. Civil War. These were subjects for his poetry and conversation. Charles Sumner, the fiery abolitionist and legislator, was a frequent guest and major influence on Henry's anti-slavery beliefs. Other members of this influential circle were James Russell Lowell and William Dean Howells, editors of the durable Atlantic Monthly, founded in 1857 as a platform for public opinion. Guests sooner or later found themselves immersed in family life. With 5 surviving children, a large staff of servants, and numerous pets, the Longfellow home was more than a shrine to the past or a scholarly ivory tower. Henry and Fanny's children were full participants in the world within this house and grew up to embrace the world at large. Over the years, the furnishings of the house came to match its history. Every painting, photograph, book, artifact, and piece of furniture seems to tell its own distinctive story, and the diaries and documents of the Longfellow family bring these stories to life. Altogether, there are 35,000 items, including furnishings and decorative arts, a fine arts collection of paintings and sculptures, and an 11,000-volume library. The site's archives hold roughly 750,000 pieces of archival material, including photographs, extensive correspondence, and manuscripts collected for their association with George Washington and other famous figures. Daughter Alice and grandson Harry Dana lived in the house until their deaths in 1928 and 1950, respectively. They carried on the family's interests in history and education. Under their stewardship, the house and its furnishings were preserved for future generations to enjoy. The formal garden became known as a work of landscape architecture in the colonial revival style. Washington's home and headquarters, then at the height of his fame, E. Longfellow never felt slighted when visitors came to his door asking to see Washington's headquarters. He took pride in his home's legendary status. The decisions and alliances Washington had made here ultimately led to freedom from Great Britain and the beginnings of the new nation. General George Washington took command of the Continental Army in July 1775, shortly after the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. Arriving in Cambridge to set up headquarters, he encountered a bleak prospect. The mostly young and inexperienced army of nearly 20,000 officers and militia members had no tents, blankets, or gunpowder and lacked many other necessary items. They faced smallpox, dysentery, and New England's bitterly cold winter. The reflection on my situation and that of my army produces many an unhappy hour when all around me are wrapped in sleep, Washington wrote. I have often thought how much happier I should have been if I had taken my musket upon my shoulder and entered the ranks. Washington and his officers were determined to right matters and met often in Longfellow's future study. Washington was busy consulting with many friends and dignitaries, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Benedict Arnold, and the chiefs of several Native American tribes. African-American poet Phyllis Wheatley was invited to visit after he received inspiring verse from her. George Washington portrait by James Peale, around 1787-90. Martha Washington arrived in December 1775 after a month-long journey from Virginia and a political controversy while in Philadelphia. Her son, daughter-in-law, and several people the Washingtons enslaved accompanied her. Establishing a precedent for the rest of the war, Martha inspired soldiers and acted as a trusted advisor, confidant, and emotional support for the commander.
Thank you for joining me on the tour of the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters. I hope you've enjoyed uncovering the secrets of this incredible American landmark. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.
Okay, let's go.